Two rifles lie on a table. Same cartridge, same silhouette. The same curved magazine, the same long forend, the same slope of the stock. From 10 feet away, they are the same gun. Now hand them to a soldier and ask him to swap the parts between them. He cannot swap a single one. Not the bolt, not the trigger, not the firing pin, not even the magazine. One of these rifles was designed by Mikhail Kalashnikov in the Soviet Union and carried by more armies than any weapon in history. The other came from a small research office in Brno, Czechoslovakia, the one army in the entire Warsaw Pact that looked at the Kalashnikov and refused to build it. That rifle is the Vyzezd 58, and the project that produced it had a code name, Koste. In Czech, it means the broom. You will hear this story told one way, that the Czechs set out to build an AK killer, that their rifle beat the Kalashnikov in Soviet testing, outshot it, outclassed it, and embarrassed Moscow at its own game. It is a good story. It is the reason a lot of people go looking at this rifle in the first place. But it is mostly legend, and the truth underneath it is stranger, and in the end, sadder than the legend that grew over the top of it. Because the Vyzezd 58 was, by almost every measurement on paper, the better rifle, lighter than the AK, more accurate than the AK, finished to a standard the AK never bothered with, and it went almost nowhere, while the Kalashnikov went everywhere. To understand how one cartridge produced two completely different rifles, and whether the broom really beat the AK or simply refused to become one, you have to start with the man who built it, a man who had already lost. If you want the real story behind the AK's identical twin and the designer who lost the competition before this one, take a second to subscribe and stay with me, because the gap between the legend and the record is exactly where this rifle gets interesting. His name was Jiří Čermák. He was born in 1926, and by the middle of the 1950s, he was a young engineer at Česká zbrojovka in Strakonice, talented, respected, and, by the one measure that mattered most, a loser. A few years earlier, Czechoslovakia had run a competition for a new automatic weapon, and the best designers in the country entered it. Václav Holek was there, the man whose light machine gun design had become the British Bren, one of the most celebrated guns of the Second World War. The Kauki brothers were there, Joseph and František, the elite of the interwar generation with their ZK-503. And Čermák, the youngest man in the room, entered two designs of his own, the CZ-5115 and the CZ-522, and then the field simply emptied. Václav Holek died in late 1954. The Kauki brothers, comfortable in Prague, refused to relocate to the Research Institute in Brno, where the secret work was moving, and without the move, they were shut out of it. The legends were gone. What remained at the National Research Office, called Constructa Brno, was the young man who had lost. By one account, he was very nearly the only person left there with real experience designing weapons of this kind. The loser inherited the project by default. Then the politics changed everything. In 1955, the Warsaw Pact formalized the Eastern Bloc under Soviet command, and with it came a demand: standardize. Czechoslovakia had its own intermediate cartridge, the 7.62 by 45 millimeter, and a whole family of guns built around it, the VZ-52 rifle and a matching light machine gun, a self-contained national system that owed Moscow nothing. Moscow wanted all of it gone. Every Allied army would feed on the Soviet round, the 7.62 by 39 millimeter, the cartridge of the AK-47. There was no negotiating it. There was an obvious, easy answer. Build the AK. Take the Soviet drawings, set up the tooling, and produce Kalashnikovs under license like everyone else in the pact. Czechoslovakia seriously considered doing exactly that, and then it said no. This is the decision the whole rifle hangs on, and it had almost nothing to do with a test. The Czechs had one of the oldest, proudest arms industries in Europe: Mausers, Bren guns, CZ pistols by the 100,000. Between the wars, the factories at Brno and Strakonice had armed clients across the globe. A Czech rifle was a point of national identity, not just national defense. And they did not want to become a factory stamping out another country's design. They would take the Soviet cartridge because they had no choice. They would not take the Soviet gun. So a new requirement was written: a select fire rifle chambered in 7.62 by 39 millimeter, no heavier than about 2.7 kilograms without a magazine, no longer than 850 millimeters. That weight target alone was aggressive. It put the new rifle under the Kalashnikov before a single part had been cut, and it left Čermák no room for the heavy, forgiving construction that made the AK so simple to churn out. Built entirely at home, to Czech standards, by Czech engineers. In 1956, the project opened at Konstrukta Brno under a code name that sounds like a joke until you understand what it was for. Koste, the broom. He would not build it entirely alone. His closest collaborator on the work was another engineer, Bohuslav Novotny, but the shape of the rifle and the argument it made were his. The man who had lost the last competition now had the one that would outlive him. And to meet that specification, lighter than the Kalashnikov, and sharing not one part with it, Čermák was about to do something no other Warsaw Pact designer would attempt. He was going to take the AK's cartridge and build everything around it backwards. Start with the gas system because it runs backwards from the Kalashnikovs. When an AK fires, gas from the barrel slams into a piston that is permanently attached to the bolt carrier and drives that whole long assembly rearward in one heavy stroke. It is called a long-stroke piston. It is simple, it is brutal, and it is a big part of why the AK feels the way it feels. Čermák threw it out. In the Vždyť 58, the piston is a separate part. Gas shoves it back just 19 millimeters, and then it stops, caught by its own shoulder, returned by its own little spring. It never travels with the bolt. It taps the bolt carrier like a hammer and springs home. This is a short-stroke piston, and it moves less mass, more sharply, with less disturbance to the rifle. There is no gas regulator at all. Čermák built the port so the system simply worked, in the cold, in the dust, without a knob to adjust. The whole piston rod was chromium-plated, so the fouling that clogged other rifles had less to grip. Then there is the way the rifle locks. The AK turns a bolt, rotating lugs into place like a bank vault. The Vždyť 58 does something else entirely. Inside the bolt carrier sits a separate hinged piece, a locking block, and as the action closes, that block is wedged downward into shoulders machined into the receiver. It drops into place. To unlock, the carrier lifts it back out. It is closer to the falling block of an old artillery breech than to anything Kalashnikov ever drew. And as that block swings up out of its recesses, it levers the spent case loose from the chamber, the first hardest tug of extraction done by pure geometry before the case has even started to move. A fixed blade in the receiver then flicks the empty case up and out. And the hammer isn't a hammer. Most rifles swing a pivoting hammer up into the firing pin. The Vždyť 58 uses a linear striker, a hollow steel cylinder with its own spring inside it, driving a free-floating firing pin straight forward. No swing, no arc, a striker running in a straight line. Every one of these was a choice, and every choice cost something. The dropping block and the milled receiver were slower and more expensive to make. And that is the detail that says the most about who built this rifle. By the late 1950s, the Soviets had moved the AK to a stamped sheet metal receiver, the AKM, precisely because stamping was fast and cheap, and you could flood an army with rifles. Czechoslovakia went the opposite way. The VZ-58 kept a receiver milled from a solid billet of steel, slower, costlier, more rigid, more accurate. The broom was sweeping out every assumption the Kalashnikov was built on: cheap over precise, mass over finish, good enough over exactly right, and choosing the opposite each time. The small touches tell the same story. The VZ-58 holds its bolt open on an empty magazine, so the soldier sees at a glance that he is dry. The AK never bothered. Its magazine is light aluminum alloy, not steel. It can even be topped up from SKS stripper clips through a guide on the carrier. And the thing people always want to be true, the thing the silhouette begs you to assume, that it must at least share a magazine with the AK, is false. Not one part interchanges, not the mag, not the bolt, not a pin. Its rear sight even carried a dedicated battle setting marked with a U for universalny, universal for snapping onto moving targets and fighting at night, out to 300 meters. 2 rifles, 1 cartridge, 0 shared components. It was, on the bench, a more refined weapon than the gun it resembled. The Czechoslovak army adopted it in 1958 and began issuing it in 1959, built at the State Arms Works in Uherský Brod. On paper, the broom had won its argument at home, which leaves the harder question, the one the legend gets loudest about. If this rifle was better than the AK, why did the world end up carrying the Kalashnikov instead? The answer starts with a number. Over 25 years, from 1959 to 1984, Czechoslovakia built roughly 920,000 VZ-58s. It was the standard rifle of the Czechoslovak army until the country itself split in 1993. It stayed in Slovak service for decades after that. The Slovak army only expects to finish replacing it around 2028. Nearly 70 years after Čermák drew it, the broom is still standing in armories. The soldiers who carried it had their own names for it. The fixed stock infantry version was the paddle, the folding stock airborne version, the scythe, plain, affectionate, unimpressed. 900,000 is a serious number. It is also almost nothing next to the Kalashnikov. The AK and its descendants were built in the tens of millions, by one common estimate, around 100 million. That is the gap the legend never mentions. The VZ-58 wasn't outfought on the battlefield. It was outproduced before it ever got there. The Soviet system was designed to arm the world. The Czech system was designed to arm Czechoslovakia, beautifully. But it did travel. Czechoslovakia was a busy Cold War arms dealer, and the broom followed the money and the ideology out into the world. Cuba took it. Czechoslovakia shipped batches to Laos during its civil war. It turned up across Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia, following every thread of Cold War patronage the country had. In the Nigerian Civil War, the breakaway state of Biafra fielded a documented batch, some 732 rifles. Cyprus bought them, and Turkish forces captured them when they invaded the island. In Vietnam, American long-range patrols sometimes carried captured Vizindor 58s on missions, because a rifle that didn't sound like an M16 had its uses deep in enemy territory. And then it drifted into the harder corners of the century. During the Troubles in Northern Ireland, the VZ-58 turned up in the hands of both the Provisional IRA and Loyalist paramilitaries, the same Czech rifle on both sides of a street war. The Japanese Red Army used it. In Burma, Ethnic fighters of the Karen National Union nicknamed it the woman's gun, for how light and slim it sat in the hand, a compliment in a jungle war dressed as an insult. Decades later, Kurdish Peshmerga carried V's 58s against ISIS, some of them donated by the Czech Republic itself. It appeared in Syria. And in 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, the Czechs reached back into their reserves and sent 5,000 of the old rifles east to be fired in anger again, more than 60 years after the first one left Uherský Brod. The broom went where it was sent. It was just never sent everywhere the way the Kalashnikov was. The design itself never stopped mutating either. Over the years, Czech engineers spun it into experiments the world never saw: a 7.62 by 51 mm NATO version, a 5.56 mm version, even a bullpup in 1976. None of them reached production. Čermák, for his part, never stopped. In 1966, he designed something remarkable, the URZ, the Univerzalny Ruchny Zbraň, the universal hand weapon. It was a single modular system, one core that could be built up into a rifle, a light machine gun, or a vehicle gun, sharing parts across all of them. It was, in concept, years ahead of the mainstream, the same modular idea armies would chase decades later. The Czechoslovak military wasn't interested, so Čermák talked the government into letting him develop it for export instead, and even pushed a version in 7.62 by 51 mm NATO, a communist designer building a rifle around the Western cartridge to sell to whoever would buy. Most of it went nowhere. That was the pattern of his whole career. Design something better than it needed to be, watch the system decline to use it or fail to spread it. Move on. Which brings us, finally, to the claim on the thumbnail, the one about beating the AK in Soviet testing. Because when you go looking for that test, for the trial where the broom outshot the Kalashnikov and humbled Moscow, you find something that isn't there at all. Here is what the record actually says. There was no grand Soviet fly-off in which the VZ-58 defeated the AK-47. The Czechs were not invited to prove their rifle superior to the Kalashnikov and then crowned for it. What happened was quieter and more human than that. Moscow ordered the cartridge. Prague briefly considered building the Soviet rifle, decided its own engineers could do better on their own terms, and built the broom instead. It was never a victory over the AK. It was a refusal to become one. And that refusal cost something. This is the part that even people who love this rifle tend to skip past. The VZ-58 was, by most honest measures, the finer weapon. It was lighter, about 2.9 kilograms against roughly 3.5 for the milled AK-47, and lighter still than the stamped AKM. It was more accurate, off that rigid milled receiver. It told you when it was empty. It was tighter, cleaner, better made, and none of it mattered to history the way the AK's cheapness did. The Kalashnikov's genius was that it could be built badly, anywhere, by anyone, and still work. The VZ-58's tragedy was that it had to be built well. The Soviets had already proven the point with the AKM, a stamped, riveted receiver a struggling factory could turn out by the million, and they handed those drawings to half the planet. Czechoslovakia handed no one the broom. It was too particular, too finely fitted to hand off and copy. The final irony is almost too neat. When Czechoslovakia finally went looking for a rifle to replace the broom, starting in the 1970s, the design its engineers landed on, the CZ-2000, codenamed Lada, was, mechanically, essentially an improved AK-74. It had better sights, a friendlier safety, a neater side-folding stock, But underneath all of it, it was a Kalashnikov, the exact rifle Czechoslovakia had spent a generation and a fortune avoiding. The nation that had refused to build a Kalashnikov spent 30 years fielding the un-Kalashnikov, and then, when it was finally time to move on, quietly designed a Kalashnikov after all. The rifle's afterlife carried a darker note, too. Like most Cold War arms, the V-58 outlived its politics and slipped into hands its designer never imagined: insurgents, paramilitaries, terrorists. A civilian semi-automatic version was the weapon used in the Quebec City mosque shooting in 2017. A rifle built to arm one small country's soldiers became, like the AK it refused to be, just another gun loose in the world. The broom didn't beat the Kalashnikov. It simply refused to be one, and paid for that refusal by being better than a rifle needed to be in a century that only rewarded being cheap enough. Go back to the two rifles on the table. Same cartridge, same silhouette, not one shared part. You were told at the start that one of them beat the other in a Soviet test. You know now that it didn't, that there was no test, only a decision, and the decision is the whole story. The VZIN-58 was never an AK killer. It never tried to be. It was something rarer and more stubborn than that. It was the answer of one small, proud country to the most successful weapon of its century. A country that looked at the Kalashnikov, took only what it was forced to take, the cartridge, and built everything else its own way. Better and slower and by hand, because it could. Think about the man who made it. Jiří Čermák lost the competition that was supposed to define him. He inherited the broom because the legends above him had died or refused to move. He built a rifle that beat the AK on every bench in the country and lost to it everywhere that counted. He drew a modular weapons system decades ahead of its time and watched his own army wave it off. He was right, over and over, in steel, where anyone could check, and the world mostly carried the other gun anyway. Late in his life, he set it all down in a memoir and gave it a title with no drama in it at all: 40 Years a Weapons Designer. And the broom did what a broom does. It swept out every assumption the Kalashnikov stood on: cheap, stamped, good enough, and set a cleaner standard in their place. Then the century swept it aside and replaced it, in the end, with the very design it had refused. But it is still here. It stood in Slovak service into the 2020s. It sat in Czech reserve racks for 60 years. And in 2022, 5,000 of them were pulled from those racks, crated up, and sent east into Ukraine, old rifles, milled and hand-fitted in a country that no longer exists, chambered for a Russian cartridge pointed back at Russia. Two rifles, same round, from 10 feet, the same gun. Pick up the Czech one, and you are holding the quiet, expensive, stubborn proof that even inside the Warsaw Pact, at least one country looked at the Kalashnikov and decided it could do better. And did. And it didn't matter. And it built it anyway.